They thought they were managing substances. The substances were managing them. Hey guys, tonight we're talking about the oldest relationship humanity has ever had. Older than marriage, older than money, older than war. It's the relationship between the human brain and the substances that make it feel something other than reality. Here's the thing that should bother you before we even start. The same species that invented writing, built cathedrals, landed on the moon, and mapped the human genome has spent the entirety of its existence desperately trying to alter its own consciousness. Every single civilization, every continent, every era, no exceptions. You could argue that cooking is universal, or that music is universal, but drug use is more universal than both. Archaeologists have yet to find a single human society across all of recorded and pre-recorded history that did not use some form of psychoactive substance. Not one. That's not a footnote. That's a pattern. And here's the paradox that makes it genuinely strange. The substances that humanity first reached for weren't escapes from suffering. They were technologies, tools, sacred instruments. The first people who got high weren't bored teenagers. They were priests, healers, and kings. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. The oldest written record of drug use comes from Sumer, the civilization that also gave us the wheel, writing, and the concept of law. Around 3400 BCE, Sumerian clay tablets describe a plant they called hul-gil. Translated literally, that means joy plant. They weren't being poetic. They were being precise. The joy plant was the opium poppy, and the Sumerians cultivated it with the same systematic care they gave to wheat and barley. It was a crop. It was a medicine. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most important agricultural products in the ancient world. What's striking isn't that they used opium. What's striking is how casually enormous the scale was. Opium appeared in Sumerian medical texts as a treatment for crying children, a detail that feels almost comically dark until you realize those texts were written by people who watched half their children die before age 5. Pain management wasn't a luxury. It was survival infrastructure. The Sumerians passed their knowledge to the Assyrians, who passed it to the Egyptians, who were so enthusiastic about opium that the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents ever found, dated to around 1550 BCE, contains a recipe for a poppy-based sedative specifically designed to stop infants from screaming at night. The instruction included mixing the poppy extract with fly excrement, which suggests that even in 1550 BCE, medicine was a combination of brilliant insight and absolutely unhinged experimentation. Egypt didn't just use opium medically, it traded it. By 1300 BCE, the Egyptians were exporting opium across the Mediterranean, to Cyprus, to Greece, to the civilizations of the Aegean. This is the moment when a sacred plant becomes a commodity, and the story of that transformation is something humanity will repeat with horrifying consistency for the next 5,000 years. But opium wasn't the only doorway. Across the Atlantic in the Andes Mountains, a different civilization was solving the same problem with a different plant. The Inca and their predecessors had coca, the plant that, 4,000 years later, a Viennese neurologist named Sigmund Freud would call a magical substance. Andean cultures chewed coca leaves for at least 8,000 years before anyone in Europe knew the continent existed. Archaeological evidence from coastal Peru shows that by 3000 BCE, coca was already being cultivated, traded, and used in religious ceremonies. At burial sites from this period, archaeologists regularly find skeletons buried with their mouths packed with coca leaves and lime powder. Because the alkaline compound in lime activates the cocaine in coca, and whoever buried those people wanted to make sure the dead were comfortable for the journey. Coca wasn't just a recreational stimulant. At altitude, where oxygen is thin and the body screams for rest, coca suppresses hunger, suppresses fatigue, and suppresses altitude sickness. For people living and working above 10,000 feet, coca wasn't a luxury. It was a physiological necessity. The Inca Empire, one of the most administratively sophisticated civilizations in the pre-Columbian Americas, ran partially on coca. Messengers who ran relay routes across the Andes, sometimes covering hundreds of miles in a matter of days, chewed coca continuously. It wasn't cheating, it was standard operating procedure. The Inca state controlled coca production with rigid bureaucratic precision. Coca fields were imperial property. Distribution was managed by the government. Access was rationed by social class, with the nobility and the priesthood receiving far greater allocations than common workers. And here, for the first time in this story, something deeply important becomes visible. The people who controlled the drug controlled the society. The coca supply wasn't just an agricultural concern, it was a political instrument. While Egypt traded opium and the Inca rationed coca, somewhere in the forests of Siberia, a third tradition was unfolding, and this one is genuinely strange even by the standards of ancient drug history. Siberian shamans used Amanita muscaria, the red and white spotted fly agaric mushroom, as the centerpiece of religious ritual. This is the mushroom on Christmas ornaments, the mushroom in fairy tales, the mushroom that appears in the background of 100 cultural images so familiar that nobody thinks to ask why. And the answer, it turns out, involves shamans drinking each other's urine. The fly agaric contains muscimol, a psychoactive compound that, unlike most substances, passes through the human body largely intact, meaning that the urine of someone who has consumed fly agaric is itself psychoactive, and significantly more potent than the original mushroom, because the body filters out some of the compounds that cause nausea while the muscimol remains. Siberian shamans understood this empirically, without any chemistry, simply through observation and practice. They consumed the mushroom, entered a trance state, communicated with spirits, and then passed their activated urine to others in the community who could not afford or access the mushrooms directly. This is either the most resourceful recycling program in human history or the most disturbing gift-giving tradition, depending on your perspective. But the practice points to something serious. The shaman wasn't getting high for entertainment. The shaman's altered state was the community's interface with the invisible world, disease, weather, the favour of forces that could not be bargained with through ordinary perception. The drug wasn't a vice, it was the technology that made religion operational. This is the pattern that holds across every early drug culture, and it's the one fact that most modern conversations about drugs completely ignore. In ancient India, the Vedic texts, some of the oldest religious writings known to humanity, describe a ritual drink called soma with an intensity that borders on obsession. Soma was consumed by priests during ceremonies, and the texts describe it as both a god and a substance simultaneously. Entire hymns are addressed directly to soma. The drink brought visions, brought power, brought connection to the divine. What soma actually was remains genuinely contested among scholars. Leading candidates include cannabis, fly agaric and ephedra, but the identity of the plant matters less than the role it played. Soma was the mechanism by which ordinary humans accessed extraordinary states. The drug was the door. In ancient Greece, the Eleusinian Mysteries, a religious initiation ceremony held annually for nearly 2,000 years, almost certainly involved a psychedelic drink called kykeon. The Mysteries were arguably the most important religious institution in the ancient Greek world. Initiates included Plato, Aristotle, and virtually every significant figure in Greek intellectual history. All of them took an oath of absolute secrecy about what occurred during the ceremony. For 2 millennia, that secret held, which means humanity maintained a sacred drug ritual more successfully than it has ever maintained almost any other secret. Modern analysis of archaeological residue from the site at Eleusis has found ergot alkaloids, precursors to LSD, in drinking vessels from the period. The oldest democracy in Western history may have been philosophically shaped, at its foundations, by a carefully administered psychedelic experience. The Scythians, the nomadic warriors of the Eurasian steppe, feared enough that the Persians avoided fighting them in open territory, had their own tradition. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described Scythian funeral rituals involving tents filled with hemp smoke, inside which the mourners inhaled until they howled with pleasure. For 2,000 years, scholars treated this description as exaggeration or metaphor. Then archaeologists excavated Scythian burial mounds and found bronze vessels containing hemp seeds and stones still blackened by fire. Herodotus wasn't exaggerating, he was reporting. What all of these traditions share is a quality that gets lost entirely in the modern conversation about drugs: intentionality. The Sumerian physician who prescribed opium knew what it did. The Inca administrator who rationed coca understood its power. The Siberian shaman who consumed fly agaric entered the experience within a framework of purpose, ritual, and community responsibility. None of these people stumbled into addiction by accident. They had systems, pharmaceutical, agricultural, spiritual, political, designed to manage the relationship between humans and these substances. Some of those systems were sophisticated, some were brutal, but they existed. The catastrophe that comes later, and it does come repeatedly, with the force of something inevitable, doesn't happen because humanity discovered drugs. It happens because those management systems broke down, because substances moved faster than cultures could adapt, because the people who profited from addiction discovered they could profit more from chaos than from control. That breakdown begins, as so many things in human history begin, with trade. With the moment when a sacred plant crosses a border and becomes a product. With the moment when the person selling the substance has no relationship with the person consuming it, no stake in their well-being, and every incentive to maximize the transaction. The Sumerians called it the joy plant. They weren't wrong. But joy, it turns out, has a price, and the invoice doesn't always arrive immediately. Sometimes it takes decades, sometimes it takes empires, and sometimes, as the next 5,000 years of history will demonstrate with relentless consistency, it takes both. The trade routes were already opening, the merchants were already moving, and somewhere in the ancient world a boat was being loaded with something that would eventually change the course of civilizations, not because it was powerful, but because it was profitable. The earliest known recipe in human history is not for bread, it's not for stew, it's for beer. A 4,000-year-old Sumerian poem called the Hymn to Ninkasi, the goddess of brewing, is simultaneously a religious text and a step-by-step brewing instruction manual. The Sumerians apparently saw no contradiction between the sacred and the fermented. They were right not to. In the ancient world, beer wasn't a beverage people chose when they wanted to relax. It was a caloric staple, a water purification system, and a social organizing tool, all compressed into a clay vessel. The fermentation process killed the pathogens that made river water lethal. Drinking beer instead of untreated water wasn't decadence. It was basic survival strategy with a pleasant side effect. But the pleasant side effect was not incidental. It was, from the very beginning, the point. The moment alcohol entered the picture, it didn't just solve a sanitation problem, it restructured social reality. People who drank together relaxed their boundaries, loosened their suspicion of strangers, and became dramatically more willing to cooperate on tasks that required trust. Anthropologists have argued, with real supporting evidence, that alcohol played a meaningful role in enabling large-scale human cooperation, the kind required to build cities, coordinate agriculture, and maintain complex political hierarchies. Beer didn't just accompany civilization. It may have been one of the mechanisms that made civilization biochemically possible. Egypt understood this with bureaucratic precision that would be admirable if it weren't so calculating. The workers who built the pyramids at Giza were not slaves. This is one of history's most persistent and most wrong assumptions. They were paid labourers, and their payment came in a specific combination of bread, onions, and beer. Archaeological excavations of the workers' village at Giza have found brewery remains capable of producing an estimated 10,000 gallons of beer per day. That number deserves a moment of genuine pause. 10,000 gallons daily. For a workforce of roughly 10,000 labourers, every single worker received approximately 4 to 5 litres of beer per day as part of their standard compensation package. This was not generosity, it was engineering. The pharaoh's administration understood that beer served multiple functions simultaneously. It provided calories, it provided hydration in a desert climate, it created social cohesion among workers from different regions, and it produced a mild, consistent state of compliance that made managing a massive labour force significantly easier. The state didn't just tolerate the workers' alcohol consumption, it manufactured it, distributed it, and used it as the primary mechanism of labour control. The world's first welfare state ran on beer, and the pharaoh sat at the top of the entire supply chain. Control the grain, control the breweries, control the beer, control the people. The logic was airtight, the execution was flawless, and the precedent it set, that whoever controls the supply of a psychoactive substance controls the population that consumes it, would echo through every subsequent chapter of this story. Wine arrived differently. Wine didn't spread through practical necessity the way beer did. Wine spread through aspiration. The earliest evidence of winemaking comes from the Caucasus region, modern-day Georgia, around 6000 BCE, making wine roughly as old as the wheel. From there it moved into Mesopotamia, into Anatolia, into the Levant, and eventually into the Mediterranean basin, where it found in Greece and Rome the civilizations that would turn it from a beverage into an ideology. In ancient Greece, the symposium, the formal dinner party that was the primary social institution of the Athenian elite, was structured entirely around wine consumption. The word symposium literally means drinking together. These weren't casual gatherings. They were carefully ritualized events with specific rules about how wine should be diluted, in what ratios, and at what pace. The Greeks considered drinking undiluted wine to be barbaric, a category of behavior associated specifically with non-Greek peoples. Civilization, by Greek definition, included the proper management of wine. The barbarians weren't just geographically outside Greece, they were behaviorally outside it, and their most diagnostic behavioral failure was drinking wine wrong. This distinction mattered politically. Wine consumption became a marker of cultural status, a signal of refinement, a proof of belonging to the world of ideas and governance rather than the world of labour and necessity. The poor drank rough wine cut heavily with water. The elite drank better wine, more carefully prepared, in settings designed to produce specific mental states conducive to philosophy, poetry, and political discussion. Plato's dialogues, the foundational text of Western philosophy, are set at symposia. The birth of democracy and the birth of the formalized drinking party happened in the same city, at roughly the same time, among the same people. Dionysus, the god of wine, was not simply a deity of pleasure. His mythology was fundamentally about the dissolution of social order, the moment when the careful structures of civilization temporarily collapse and something rawer, more honest and more dangerous emerges. His festivals, the Dionysia, involved theatrical performances, the origin of Western drama, as well as ritual intoxication, processions and behaviours that in any other context would have been criminal. But within the festival's frame, they were sacred. The Greeks built a scheduled, state-sanctioned release valve for the chaos that alcohol enables, and called it religion. It was one of the more psychologically sophisticated pieces of social engineering in the ancient world. Rome inherited Greek wine culture and promptly took it to dimensions that would have embarrassed even the most enthusiastic Greek symposiast. Roman wine consumption scaled with the empire. By the 1st century CE, Rome was importing wine from across the Mediterranean, from Spain, from Gaul, from North Africa, in a volume that required hundreds of thousands of ceramic amphorae annually. The city of Rome alone, with a population of roughly 1 million people, consumed an estimated 100 million litres of wine per year. That's approximately 100 litres per person, including children and slaves, who were also given wine rations. The infrastructure required to sustain this consumption was staggering. Vineyards across multiple continents, complex shipping networks, storage facilities, taxation systems, and a class of professional merchants whose entire economic existence depended on keeping Rome perpetually supplied. The Roman state, like the Egyptian state before it, understood exactly what it was doing. The famous policy of bread and circuses, providing free grain and entertainment to the urban poor to prevent political instability, was always accompanied by cheap wine. The complete package was bread, wine, and spectacle, and the wine was not an afterthought. A population that is adequately fed, adequately entertained, and mildly intoxicated on a regular basis is a population that does not revolt. The Romans didn't discover this principle, they industrialized it. But then came the detail that changes the entire story of Rome's relationship with wine, a detail so strange and so consequential that it deserves its own moment of attention. The Romans had a problem with wine that tasted too sharp. Their solution was to add sweetness, and the sweetening agent they discovered worked best was a syrup called sapa, produced by boiling down grape juice or wine in lead vessels. The lead leached into the syrup during the boiling process. The Romans then added this lead-laced sweetener to wine, to food, to sauces, essentially to anything that needed to taste less acidic. Roman medical texts actually recommended sapa as a health product. Roman cookbooks included it as a standard ingredient. The ruling class, who ate the most elaborate food and drank the most heavily sweetened wine, consumed lead at rates that modern toxicologists estimate would have produced chronic lead poisoning in the majority of Rome's aristocracy. Chronic lead poisoning causes neurological damage, impaired judgment, infertility, and mental instability. The Roman Empire's upper class, its senators, its generals, its emperors, was for centuries running an empire while slowly poisoning their own brains. Some historians have argued with toxicological evidence that lead poisoning contributed meaningfully to the erratic behaviour of several Roman emperors, the declining birth rates among the Roman aristocracy, and the gradual institutional collapse that preceded the empire's fall. Rome didn't just fall. It was drunk, sweetened with lead, and slowly losing its mind at the top, while the people at the bottom wondered why the decisions coming from the palace made less and less sense with each passing generation. The fall of Rome didn't end wine culture, it relocated it. The Catholic Church, which inherited the infrastructure of the Roman Empire along with its territorial ambitions, adopted wine as a sacrament. The Eucharist required wine. Monasteries became Europe's primary winemakers. By the medieval period, the Church controlled the most sophisticated viticulture in the Western world. The vineyards of Burgundy, Bordeaux, and the Rhine Valley were largely monastic operations. The same institution that preached temperance as a moral virtue was simultaneously running the continent's most productive alcohol industry. The hypocrisy was noted even at the time. It was also completely irrelevant to business operations. Medieval Europeans drank staggering quantities of alcohol. Estimates suggest average consumption of roughly 3 litres of ale or wine per day per adult, driven by the same logic as ancient Egypt. Fermented beverages were safer than most available water sources. Children drank small beer, a low-alcohol version brewed specifically for them. The daily reality of medieval life was a population operating in a state of mild, continuous intoxication from childhood through death, because sobriety, in the absence of clean water infrastructure, was genuinely more dangerous than its alternative. This is the world that the next wave of substances was about to enter, a world already thoroughly organized around alcohol, already accustomed to the idea that psychoactive substances were inseparable from daily life, already shaped by the understanding that whoever controls the supply controls everything that follows. The trade routes that had carried opium across the Mediterranean were about to expand into something vastly larger, and the substances moving along those routes were about to collide with civilizations that had no framework whatsoever for understanding what was coming. The Silk Road was never just about silk. That name, invented by a 19th century German geographer, flattened one of the most complex trade networks in human history into a single commodity. The reality was a 7,000-mile web of interconnected routes moving spices, textiles, glass, gold, disease, religion, technology, and drugs. Lots of drugs. The Silk Road didn't introduce the world to psychoactive substances. It industrialized their distribution at a scale that no previous civilization had managed or even imagined possible. What made the Silk Road genuinely dangerous, in the specific sense that matters for this story, was speed. A cultural tradition around a substance takes generations to develop. The rituals, the taboos, the medical knowledge, the social boundaries, all of it accumulates slowly through painful trial and error in communities where everyone knows everyone and consequences are visible and immediate. Trade routes destroyed that process. A substance could now move from its place of origin to a completely foreign culture in months, arriving without any of the accompanying framework that made it manageable in its homeland. It was like receiving a powerful piece of technology with no instruction manual and no safety warnings, in a language you didn't speak. Cannabis was one of the first substances to make this journey, and its migration across the ancient world is one of the more remarkable stories in botanical history. The plant originated in Central Asia, modern-day Kazakhstan and Mongolia, where it had been used for fiber, food, and psychoactive purposes for at least 5,000 years. From there it moved in 2 directions simultaneously. Westward, carried by Scythian nomads, it entered Persia, then the Middle East, then North Africa. Eastward, it travelled into India, where it became embedded in Hindu religious practice as one of the 5 sacred plants mentioned in the Vedas. The god Shiva was said to be particularly fond of it. Indian sadhus consumed cannabis as part of devotional practice, with a casualness that suggested the relationship was ancient and comfortable, which it was. The westward journey produced a different outcome. In Persia and the Arab world, cannabis was processed into hashish, concentrated resin, far more potent than raw plant material. Arab traders carried hashish along the Silk Road into Egypt, into the Levant, into the emerging trade cities of the Mediterranean. By the 9th century CE, hashish use was widespread across the Islamic world. Despite or perhaps because of the Quran's prohibition on wine, alcohol was forbidden. Hashish occupied a theological grey area that religious scholars argued about for centuries, and while they argued, millions of people consumed it. Then came the story that entered European legend and almost certainly distorted the Western understanding of drugs and violence for the next 1,000 years. Marco Polo, travelling through Persia in the 13th century, recorded the story of Hassani Sabah, the founder of the Nizari Ismaili sect, known to the Crusaders as the Assassins. According to the legend that circulated through Europe, Hassan recruited his killers by secretly drugging them with hashish, transporting them to a beautiful garden filled with luxury and women, convincing them they had experienced paradise, and then promising them return after they completed their missions. The Arabic word for hashish user, hashishin, was allegedly the origin of the word assassin. The story was almost certainly false, or at minimum wildly exaggerated. The Nizari were a real political and military organisation, and their targeted assassinations of political enemies were real and historically documented. But the hashish paradise story appears in no contemporary Islamic sources. It was recorded primarily by European travellers and Crusader chroniclers, who had every political incentive to portray their enemies as drug-crazed fanatics. The assassin hashish connection was medieval propaganda, the 12th century equivalent of a cable news segment designed to make a foreign enemy seem both threatening and degenerate. What the legend actually reveals is something more interesting than its content. Europe, which had no cultural framework for hashish, reached immediately for the most alarming possible explanation. The drug wasn't understood as a religious substance, a medical tool, or a cultural tradition. It was understood as a weapon of manipulation, a means of control, a substance that stripped away human agency and turned ordinary people into instruments of violence. This framing, drugs as tools of external control rather than expressions of human desire, would persist in Western drug policy thinking for centuries, and it was wrong from the very beginning. While hashish was moving westward, opium was moving eastward, and this is where the story of the Silk Road becomes something genuinely dark. China's first encounter with opium was not through addiction, it was through medicine. Arab traders introduced opium to China around the 7th century CE, during the Tang dynasty, as a pharmaceutical product. Chinese physicians recognized its pain management properties immediately and incorporated it into the pharmacopoeia with the same practical efficiency that had characterized Sumerian medicine 2,000 years earlier. For several centuries, China's relationship with opium was controlled, medicinal, and without the characteristics of widespread addiction. The critical variable that hadn't yet been introduced was the pipe. Tobacco arrived in China in the late 16th century, carried by Portuguese traders, and with tobacco came the technology of smoking. Before smoking, opium was consumed orally, eaten, dissolved in liquid, applied as a paste. Effective, but slow and imprecise in its dosage. Smoking opium delivered the drug to the brain in seconds, producing an intensity of effect that oral consumption could never match. When Chinese users began mixing opium with tobacco and smoking the combination, and then smoking pure opium in dedicated pipes, the pharmacological equation changed entirely. The addiction rate among regular smokers was dramatically higher than among oral users. The onset was faster, the high was more intense, and the withdrawal was proportionally more severe. By the early 17th century, opium smoking had spread through Chinese port cities. By the mid-17th century, the Chinese emperor issued an edict banning opium smoking. By the late 17th century, it was banned again, and again. The bans failed every time, not because enforcement was weak, though it was, but because by the time the government responded, demand had already outpaced any realistic suppression capacity. The substance had arrived faster than the institutions designed to manage it. The Silk Road wasn't just moving substances between established civilizations, it was creating new demand in places that had never existed before, and the merchants who supplied that demand were learning something that would become one of the most consequential commercial insights in history. Addictive substances were the perfect trade commodity. They created their own repeat customers. A merchant who sold silk had to find a new buyer for the next shipment. A merchant who sold opium to someone who had never tried it before had, with reasonable probability, found a customer for life, or at least for as long as the customer's finances and health held out. The economic logic was irresistible. Addiction, viewed purely as a commercial phenomenon, was a subscription model invented 2,000 years before anyone used that term. Arab traders understood this. Indian merchants understood it. The Portuguese, who in the 16th century built the first European trading empire in Asia, understood it with particular clarity. They established opium trading routes from India to China, from China to Southeast Asia, with a commercial efficiency that reflected genuine business sophistication. The Portuguese Estado da India, the administrative structure of Portugal's Asian empire, treated opium as a premium commodity. It was taxed, regulated, and traded under state monopoly. The government wasn't fighting the drug trade. The government was running it. Meanwhile, the Silk Road was carrying something else that deserves attention, something that shaped the modern world's relationship with consciousness-altering substances in ways that went far beyond any single drug. Ideas travelled the Silk Road too. Alchemical knowledge, medical theory, botanical classification, all of it moved between the Islamic world, India, China, and eventually Europe. Islamic scholars preserved and expanded Greek medical knowledge, including Greek pharmacology. The Canon of Medicine, written by the Persian physician Ibn Sina, known in Europe as Avicenna, in the early 11th century, was the most comprehensive medical text in the world for several centuries. It discussed opium, cannabis, and alcohol with clinical precision, categorizing their effects, their therapeutic applications, and their dangers. Ibn Sina was not naive about addiction. He described opium dependence with a clinical accuracy that wouldn't be matched in Western medicine for another 800 years. The tragedy is that his warnings travelled the same routes as the substances he was warning about, and the warnings, unlike the substances, required literacy, institutional infrastructure, and cultural willingness to receive them. The opium arrived first. The cautionary literature arrived later. This sequencing, substance before understanding, commerce before consequence, is not a coincidence. It is the structural feature of every drug epidemic in history, and it was already fully operational in the medieval world. The Silk Road began contracting in the 15th century, as sea routes opened and the overland networks became less economically dominant. But the trade it had established didn't disappear. It transformed. The substances that had travelled by camel caravan began travelling by ship, in larger quantities, over longer distances, between civilizations even less prepared for what was coming. The Portuguese trading networks that the Estado da India built in Asia were the direct predecessor of what the British East India Company would later construct, and what the British built was not a trade network. It was a weapon. But before that weapon was aimed, something unexpected happened. Two new substances arrived in Europe from opposite ends of the earth, and they changed daily life on the continent more profoundly than anything that had come before. They weren't narcotics, they didn't cause visions, they didn't suppress pain or induce sleep. They did something that, in retrospect, was far more economically significant. They made people more alert, more productive, and more capable of sitting still for long periods of focused mental work. One came from the mountains of Ethiopia, the other came from the forests of China, and together they built the modern world. Coffee was discovered, according to the most persistent legend, by a goat herder in Ethiopia who noticed his animals wouldn't sleep after eating berries from a particular tree. The goat herder reported this to a nearby monastery. The monks, who spent their nights in prayer and their days fighting exhaustion, immediately boiled the berries into a drink and discovered that God apparently had been generous enough to include a stimulant in the natural world. Whether the story is true is almost beside the point. What matters is what happened next. By the 15th century, coffee had moved from Ethiopian highlands into Yemen, where Sufi monks used it to sustain nighttime devotional practices. From Yemen it spread to Mecca, to Cairo, to Constantinople. By the early 16th century, the Ottoman Empire had coffee houses, kahvekhane, operating in every major city. These were not simply places to drink a hot beverage. They were the first public spaces in history specifically designed for sober, alert, extended conversation. People played chess, listened to music, exchanged news, conducted business, and argued about politics for hours on end, stimulated by a substance that sharpened thought instead of dulling it. The coffee house was a fundamentally new kind of social institution, and the authorities recognized it as a threat almost immediately. The Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent banned coffee in 1511. His reasoning was direct. Coffee houses were places where people gathered, talked, and developed opinions about their rulers. A sedated population was manageable. An alert, socially organized population was dangerous. The ban failed within months. The demand was too established, the trade networks too profitable, and the population too thoroughly converted to give up its morning ritual for the sake of political anxiety at the top. Coffee reached Europe in the mid-1600s and produced an identical sequence of events: enthusiasm, explosion in popularity, government panic, ban, failure of ban, with a speed that suggests Europeans had learned nothing from watching the same pattern repeat in the Ottoman Empire 50 years earlier. Charles II of England banned coffee houses in 1675, citing them as places where divers false, malicious and scandalous reports are devised and spread abroad to the defamation of His Majesty's government. He repealed the ban 11 days later, having discovered that the English public's attachment to its coffee was stronger than its deference to royal authority. What Charles II had actually stumbled upon was the revolutionary nature of coffee as a social technology. Before coffee houses, European public life was organised around taverns and alehouses, environments where alcohol progressively impaired judgment as the evening went on. Business negotiations held in taverns were conducted by men whose cognitive function deteriorated in proportion to how long the meeting lasted. Coffee houses replaced this with a radically different chemistry. Customers arrived, consumed a stimulant, became more alert over time rather than less, and conducted their affairs in a state of heightened rather than diminished mental function. The consequences were staggering in their scope. Lloyd's of London, the insurance market that still underwrites a significant portion of global commerce, began as Edward Lloyd's Coffee House on Tower Street in 1688. Merchants, ship captains and underwriters gathered there to exchange information about shipping routes and negotiate insurance contracts. The coffee house's atmosphere of caffeinated focus and open information exchange was so productive that it essentially invented the modern insurance industry as a byproduct of people drinking coffee and talking. The London Stock Exchange evolved from Jonathan's Coffee House, where brokers gathered to trade shares. The first English newspapers were distributed in coffee houses and largely written by people who spent their working days in them. The Royal Society, Britain's premier scientific institution, held early meetings in coffee houses. The Enlightenment, that extraordinary explosion of rational inquiry that reshaped Western civilization's relationship with knowledge and authority, was conducted largely by men sitting in coffee houses, drinking coffee, and thinking more clearly than their wine-soaked predecessors had managed to do. The relationship between caffeine and the Enlightenment is not metaphorical, it is pharmacological. A civilization that switched its primary daily beverage from a mild depressant to a mild stimulant was, at the population level, changing its cognitive baseline. Europe didn't just get new ideas in the 17th and 18th centuries, it got a new neurochemical environment in which those ideas could develop and spread. Tea had been doing this in China for 1,000 years already. Chinese tea culture dates to at least the Tang dynasty, 7th century CE, and by the Song dynasty, it had developed into one of the most elaborate aesthetic and social traditions in the world. The Japanese tea ceremony, Chanoyu, took these traditions and elevated them into a philosophy of attention and presence that influenced architecture, garden design, ceramics, and social interaction for centuries. Tea in East Asia was never simply a drink, it was a practice, a structured engagement with time, attention, and social relationship that used a mild psychoactive substance as its vehicle. Britain's encounter with tea began commercially in the 17th century and rapidly escalated into something that altered the country's geopolitical trajectory. The British East India Company began importing Chinese tea in 1664, and within decades it had become the company's most profitable commodity. By the mid-18th century, Britain was importing £11 million of tea annually. By the end of the 18th century, that number had grown to £23 million. Tea had gone from an exotic luxury to a national necessity in less than a century, and the speed of that transformation created a trade problem with consequences that still shape the modern world. China had everything Britain wanted. Britain had almost nothing China wanted. Trade was conducted in silver, British silver flowing into China in enormous quantities, steadily draining the empire's monetary reserves. The British East India Company's accountants could see the structural problem clearly. The tea trade was profitable in terms of volume but hemorrhaging in terms of currency. Something had to fill the gap. Something China didn't have but could be persuaded to want. Something addictive enough to create a self-sustaining demand that would balance the books. The answer they arrived at was opium. The company already controlled opium production in Bengal, a byproduct of its Indian territorial expansion. The math was straightforward. Grow opium in India, sell it in China, use the proceeds to buy tea, sell the tea in Britain. A triangular trade that converted one addiction into the currency needed to supply another. Britain's tea habit would be funded by China's opium habit. The East India Company wasn't shy about the mechanics of this arrangement. Internal company documents discussed the opium trade with the dispassionate language of supply chain management. The words addiction and devastation don't appear. The words profit and balance of payments appear constantly. This was the moment when the story of drugs made a turn that the Sumerian pharmacist, the Inca administrator, and the Siberian shaman could not have imagined. A nation-state operating through a corporate proxy made the deliberate and calculated decision to addict another nation's population as an economic strategy, not as a side effect, not as an unforeseen consequence, as a plan. But before that plan reached its full catastrophic expression, something else was happening in the West that deserves attention, because it reveals the same logic operating at the domestic level, inside the society that would soon impose addiction on others from the outside. By the 18th century, Europe had developed what historians politely call a gin craze, and the reality behind that polite term was something closer to a public health catastrophe. Gin had been introduced to England in the late 17th century, Initially as a medicine, Dutch courage, soldiers called it, after drinking Dutch Geneva before battle. When William of Orange took the English throne in 1689, he promoted domestic distilling partly to reduce dependence on French brandy imports. The result was an explosion in cheap gin production that flooded the poorest neighbourhoods of London with a spirit so inexpensive that the famous advertising slogan of the era, "Drunk for a penny, dead drunk for twopence, clean straw for nothing," was not satire. It was a price list. By the 1720s, London was producing 10 million gallons of gin per year for a population of roughly 600,000. William Hogarth's 1751 engraving Gin Lane, showing a collapsing urban landscape populated by skeletal adults, neglected children, and a woman so drunk she's dropping her infant, was not artistic exaggeration. Infant mortality rates in London's poorest parishes were catastrophically high during the gin craze's peak years. Parliamentary inquiries documented neighbourhoods where functioning adults were outnumbered by the incapacitated. The government's response was the Gin Acts, a series of regulatory attempts to control production and consumption through licensing and taxation. Several of these acts failed spectacularly, producing riots and driving production underground without reducing consumption. When the policy finally worked, in the 1750s, it succeeded not primarily because of regulation, but because grain prices rose, making cheap gin uneconomical to produce. The craze ended because the economics changed, not because the government intervened effectively. This was a lesson that would be learned and immediately forgotten many times in the centuries that followed. The craze left behind something important. The first serious public debate in Western Europe about the state's responsibility to protect citizens from addictive substances, or more precisely, the state's responsibility to protect its productive workforce from the economic inefficiency that addiction created. The moral framing came later, attached to the economic concern like paint over rust. The original worry wasn't about human suffering. It was about the fact that addicted workers were less productive, made worse soldiers, and cost the parish system more money to support. The welfare of the addict was almost entirely absent from early drug policy discussions. The welfare of the system the addict was supposed to serve was the only thing being protected. That logic, policy designed to protect economic productivity rather than human beings, was about to be exported to China at gunpoint. In 1729, the Chinese Emperor Yongzheng issued an edict banning the sale and smoking of opium. The penalty for operating an opium den was strangulation. The penalty for repeat offenders was public execution. The edict was serious, the enforcement was real, and it accomplished almost nothing, because the British East India Company had not yet fully activated its supply chain. The ban was a response to a problem that was still manageable. Within a century, it would be catastrophically unmanageable, and the reason was simple. The most powerful trading empire on earth had decided that China's drug problem was Britain's economic solution. The company's opium operation in Bengal was a masterpiece of colonial extraction. Indian farmers were compelled, through debt bondage, land tenure arrangements, and outright coercion, to grow poppy rather than food crops. The company processed the opium in its own factories, compressed it into standardized chests, and auctioned those chests to licensed private traders who then carried them to China. The company maintained what it called clean hands. Technically, company ships didn't deliver opium directly to Chinese soil. Private traders did. This was not a moral distinction. It was a legal shield, carefully constructed to give the company plausible distance from the consequences of an operation it designed, financed, and controlled at every stage. The private traders who carried opium to China were not rogue operators or criminal entrepreneurs. They were respected merchants from prominent British and American families. The great trading houses of Canton Jardine Matheson, Dent and Company, the American firm Russell and Company, built their fortunes on the opium trade. William Jardine, co-founder of Jardine Matheson, was a former company ship surgeon who became one of the wealthiest men in Britain through opium. He corresponded directly with the British Foreign Secretary about China policy. He lobbied Parliament. He was, by every social measure of his era, a pillar of civilization, and he was running the largest drug trafficking operation in human history. The scale of the operation grew with terrifying speed. In 1729, when the first Chinese ban was issued, opium imports were estimated at around 200 chests per year. By 1800, imports had reached approximately 4,000 chests. By 1838, the year before the First Opium War, the number was 40,000 chests, a 200-fold increase in a century. Each chest contained roughly 140 pounds of opium. The arithmetic produces a number so large it loses meaning until it's converted into human terms. By the 1830s, an estimated 2 million Chinese people were addicted to opium, with some provincial estimates running far higher. In certain coastal regions, local officials reported that a majority of adult male residents were regular smokers. The silver was flowing in reverse now. For centuries, China had accumulated silver from trade surpluses. By the 1830s, the opium trade had reversed the flow entirely. Silver was pouring out of China into British and Indian commercial networks at a rate that was destabilizing the Chinese monetary system. Tax revenues were falling. The military was compromised by addiction among the ranks. The civil service, which had long prided itself on Confucian discipline and intellectual rigor, was visibly deteriorating. The Daoguang Emperor, confronting a crisis of genuinely civilizational proportion, made the decision that would trigger a war. He appointed Lin Zexu. Lin was a senior official of impeccable reputation, incorruptible, methodical, and under no illusions about what he was dealing with. In March 1839, he arrived in Canton with full imperial authority to end the opium trade. His first act was to write a letter to Queen Victoria, appealing to her moral authority as a ruler and asking how Britain could justify poisoning another nation's people for profit. The letter was eloquent, logical, and built on the entirely reasonable assumption that a head of state, when presented with clear evidence of state-sponsored harm, would respond with some recognizable form of conscience. Victoria never formally replied. Lin then acted unilaterally. He surrounded the Canton trading houses, cut off their food and water supply, and demanded the surrender of all opium stocks in foreign possession. After weeks of standoff, the traders surrendered approximately 20,000 chests, roughly 3 million pounds of opium. Lin had the entire quantity destroyed on a beach outside Canton, mixed with salt and lime and washed into the sea over the course of 23 days. It was one of the largest deliberate destructions of a commercial commodity in history, and it was completely legal under Chinese law on Chinese soil. Britain went to war over it. The First Opium War, 1839 to 1842, was prosecuted by the most powerful naval force on earth against a Chinese military that hadn't meaningfully modernized its weapons technology in 2 centuries. The outcome was never in genuine doubt. British warships destroyed Chinese coastal defences with cannon fire from distances at which Chinese weapons couldn't respond effectively. The war moved up the coast with the systematic efficiency of a debt collection operation, which in a meaningful sense it was. At every engagement, the disparity in firepower was so extreme that the battles barely qualified as contests. The Treaty of Nanking, signed in 1842, forced China to cede Hong Kong to Britain, open 5 treaty ports to foreign trade, pay an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars, including 6 million specifically to to compensate British merchants for the opium that Lin Zexu had legally destroyed, and grant British citizens in China immunity from Chinese law. The opium trade was not explicitly legalized in the treaty. That detail was handled in a supplementary agreement. Britain had fought a war to protect its drug business, won comprehensively, and then written the peace terms to ensure the business could continue operating. The only thing missing from the document was a company logo. The Chinese called the period that followed the Century of Humiliation. The name is accurate and understated simultaneously. 14 years later, Britain found a pretext for a second war. The Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860, was fought jointly by Britain and France, with the United States and Russia participating as interested observers who collected benefits without firing shots. The immediate trigger, a dispute over a ship's registration documents, was so transparently inadequate as a casus belli that even British members of Parliament called it out at the time. The House of Commons passed a motion of censure against Prime Minister Palmerston's government for manufacturing a justification for war. Palmerston dissolved Parliament and called a general election. He won. The war proceeded. The outcome was the Treaty of Tientsin and the Convention of Peking, which together accomplished what the First War had not quite managed: the complete legalization of opium importation into China, the opening of additional treaty ports, and a further indemnity payment. Britain now had formal legal sanction, extracted at gunpoint, for selling narcotics in a country whose government had been trying to ban them for over a century. The operation was complete. The market was secured. The supply chain ran from Indian poppy fields through company factories in Bengal to Chinese ports under British treaty protection, and every element of it was now technically legal. By 1900, an estimated 13 million Chinese people were addicted to opium, out of a total population of approximately 400 million. That's roughly 3% of the entire population, but concentrated heavily among working-age men in coastal and river provinces, meaning the actual impact on economic and military capacity was dramatically higher than the percentage suggests. Regional governors reported districts where 30%, 40%, even 50% of adult men were regular smokers. Villages where the agricultural cycle had collapsed because too few functional adults remained to work the fields. A military so thoroughly penetrated by addiction that soldiers were reportedly smoking opium between engagements. And then came the detail that reframes the entire story in the most bitter possible way. In 1909, the United States convened the International Opium Commission in Shanghai, the first international conference ever held specifically to address the global drug trade. The commission produced what would eventually become the framework for international drug control. It was chaired and substantially organized by the United States and Britain. Britain, which had spent the better part of a century waging war to protect its opium trade, now positioned itself as a leading voice in the effort to suppress that trade internationally. The opium revenue had declined as Chinese domestic production increased and the commercial mathematics shifted. The trade that was no longer maximally profitable became, with convenient timing, morally unacceptable. Lin Zexu had argued in 1839 that it was morally unacceptable. Britain had gone to war with him for saying so. The legacy of the Opium Wars didn't end with treaties or commissions. It shaped Chinese political consciousness for the next 150 years, providing the historical foundation for a nationalism that defined itself explicitly against foreign exploitation. The Communist Party that took power in 1949 drew direct rhetorical lines from the Opium Wars to the present. The Century of Humiliation wasn't just a historical grievance. It was an active political instrument, and it remains one today. A trade policy decision made by company accountants in Calcutta in the early 19th century is still generating geopolitical consequences in the 21st. The drug hadn't just destroyed individual lives, It had altered the trajectory of the world's most populous nation, reshaped the balance of global power, and created resentments so deep that they outlasted the empire that caused them by more than a century. And while all of this was unfolding on the geopolitical stage, something equally consequential was happening in laboratories in Europe, where chemists, working with the best intentions in the world, were about to make everything significantly worse. The 19th century believed in progress the way previous centuries had believed in God, with absolute conviction, zero tolerance for doubt, and a tendency to ignore evidence that complicated the faith. Science was remaking the world. Steam engines, telegraph cables, antiseptic surgery, germ theory. Every decade produced breakthroughs that would have seemed miraculous to the previous generation. It was entirely natural within this atmosphere of breathless optimism that chemistry would turn its attention to the oldest problem in human medicine: pain. And it was entirely predictable in retrospect that the solutions chemistry produced would create problems that dwarfed the ones they solved. Morphine was isolated from opium in 1804 by a German pharmacist's assistant named Friedrich Serturner. He was 20 years old. He extracted the active alkaloid, tested it on stray dogs, then tested it on himself and 3 friends, an experimental protocol that would end careers today, but was considered admirably direct in 1804. The drug worked with an efficiency that raw opium had never achieved. Pure morphine was 10 times more potent by weight, faster in onset, more predictable in effect. Serturner named it after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. The name was accurate. It was also the last accurate thing that would be said about the drug's safety for the next several decades. The medical establishment embraced morphine with the enthusiasm of people who had spent centuries watching patients die in agony from conditions that were survivable but unbearable. Surgical patients who previously had to be held down, screaming, while surgeons worked as fast as physically possible, could now be operated on in something approaching calm. Soldiers dying of battlefield wounds could be given relief rather than rum and a leather strap to bite. Women suffering through difficult childbirth, a process that killed an alarming percentage of 19th century mothers, could be sedated. Morphine was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most significant medical advances of the century. The hypodermic needle arrived in 1853, and morphine's trajectory changed forever. Injection delivered morphine to the brain in a fraction of the time that oral consumption required, producing an intensity of effect that fundamentally altered the drug's addiction profile. The needle also carried a specific cultural authority. It was a medical instrument, used by physicians, associated with science and treatment. A person who smoked opium was, in Victorian social perception, indulging a vice. A person who received a morphine injection was receiving medicine. The same molecule, the same addiction potential, 2 completely different social frameworks. The framing determined everything about how society responded, or failed to respond. The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, created the first mass morphine addiction event in Western history. Field surgeons used morphine extensively. It was the most effective tool available for managing the catastrophic wounds produced by the war's industrialized violence. Soldiers were treated generously, sometimes excessively, without any system for managing withdrawal after treatment ended. When the war concluded, an estimated 400,000 veterans returned home with morphine dependence. Physicians at the time called it soldier's disease or army disease, a condition so prevalent among veterans that it had acquired its own clinical category. It was the opioid epidemic of the 19th century, and it produced almost no serious policy response, because the patients were largely white male veterans whose addiction had been administered by doctors. The moral framework that would later criminalize drug use simply didn't apply when the dealer wore a stethoscope. Into this environment arrived cocaine, and the story of its introduction to Western medicine is so dense with irony that it requires careful handling to convey accurately. The coca leaf had been used in the Andes for thousands of years, as established in part 1 of this story. European scientists had known about it since the Spanish conquest, but it wasn't until 1860 that German chemist Albert Niemann isolated cocaine hydrochloride from coca leaves and noted in his published paper that it produced a numbing sensation on his tongue. This observation sat largely dormant for 2 decades, until a Viennese neurologist picked it up and changed the trajectory of Western pharmacology. Sigmund Freud was 28 years old, professionally ambitious, and deeply frustrated by his inability to establish a reputation significant enough to support the woman he wanted to marry. In 1884, he began experimenting with cocaine and became immediately emphatically convinced that he had found a miracle substance. He published a paper called Über Coca, essentially a love letter to the drug, in which he praised its ability to elevate mood, suppress fatigue, eliminate depression, and cure morphine addiction. That last claim deserves particular attention. Freud was recommending cocaine as the treatment for the morphine problem that the medical profession had already created. He was proposing one powerful stimulant as the antidote to a powerful depressant, in patients whose neurochemistry had already been severely disrupted. He was, in essence, suggesting that the cure for a fire was a different kind of fire. Freud personally administered cocaine to his friend Ernst von Fleischl-Marxow, a morphine addict, and initially celebrated what appeared to be successful treatment. Within months, von Fleischl-Marxow was addicted to cocaine as well as morphine, consuming it in quantities that produced toxic psychosis. He died within a decade, in considerable suffering. Freud quietly distanced himself from his cocaine advocacy and never wrote another positive word about the drug. He did not, however, warn his professional colleagues with the urgency the situation warranted. The medical establishment had already moved past any individual's reservations. Cocaine was, by the mid-1880s, being incorporated into a staggering array of commercial products with the wholehearted endorsement of the pharmaceutical industry and the enthusiastic promotion of mainstream advertising. Carl Kohler's 1884 discovery that cocaine was an effective local anesthetic for eye surgery, genuinely one of the most important advances in surgical history, gave the drug an unimpeachable medical legitimacy that anchored its commercial expansion. If cocaine could make eye surgery possible, surely its other applications deserved equal respect. Park Davis, one of America's most respected pharmaceutical companies, sold cocaine in 15 different forms: cocaine cigarettes, cocaine for injection, cocaine for dissolving under the tongue. Their marketing materials described it as a substance that could make the user more enduring of fatigue and more enduring of hardship. A physician's endorsement circular from the period suggested that cocaine was suitable for treating hay fever, toothache, depression, and nervous exhaustion, a Victorian diagnosis broad enough to encompass almost any complaint a middle-class patient might present. Then came Coca-Cola. John Pemberton's 1886 recipe combined coca leaf extract with cola nut caffeine in a carbonated beverage marketed specifically as a brain tonic and a cure for headaches, morphine addiction, neurasthenia, and impotence. The name was not a metaphor. The original Coca-Cola contained actual cocaine. It was sold at pharmacies as a medicinal product. Early advertisements featured endorsements from physicians and testimonials about its restorative properties. By the 1890s, it was the most popular patent medicine in the American South. Angelo Mariani, a French Corsican chemist, had beaten Pemberton to the concept by 2 decades with his Vin Mariani, a Bordeaux wine infused with coca leaves. Pope Leo XIII awarded it a Vatican gold medal. Thomas Edison claimed it helped him stay awake while inventing. Ulysses S. Grant reportedly used it while writing his memoirs as he was dying of throat cancer. Vin Mariani was the product celebrity endorsement was invented for, and the celebrities were not wrong that it worked. It worked extraordinarily well. That was the problem. While cocaine was conquering the consumer market, the pharmaceutical industry was pursuing its next breakthrough with the same optimistic momentum, and produced something that would eventually eclipse both morphine and cocaine as a public health catastrophe. Bayer was, by the 1890s, already a successful chemical company best known for synthesizing aspirin. In 1898, biochemist Heinrich Drieser synthesized diacetyl morphine, a compound derived from morphine that was, in laboratory tests, significantly more potent. Drieser noted that test subjects reported feeling heroic after taking it. Bayer named the drug accordingly, heroin. Trademark registered, marketing materials prepared. Bayer launched heroin commercially in 1898 as a cough suppressant and, with a confidence that reads today as either spectacular ignorance or spectacular dishonesty, as a non-addictive substitute for morphine. The packaging explicitly made this claim. Physicians were sent samples. Medical journals published favourable reviews. Bayer sold heroin in 21 countries within the first year of production. It was available over the counter at pharmacies, recommended for children's coughs, and prescribed to morphine addicts, just as cocaine had been prescribed to morphine addicts a decade earlier, with results that Freud himself had documented as catastrophic. The pattern was by now so well established that it should have been recognizable. It was not recognized, or rather, it was recognized by patients long before it was acknowledged by the institutions that were supposed to protect them. Within a decade of heroin's commercial launch, physicians in major American cities were reporting something that the marketing materials had specifically promised could not happen: heroin addiction. Patients who had been prescribed heroin for coughs or to manage their morphine dependence were returning to clinics physically dependent on the new drug, experiencing withdrawal symptoms indistinguishable from those of morphine, sometimes worse. The cure had become the disease again. By 1910, the United States had an estimated 250,000 opiate addicts, a number that reflected morphine, heroin, and opium use combined, and that existed almost entirely as a consequence of medical prescription and commercial pharmaceutical sales. These were not people who had sought out illicit substances through criminal networks. They were people who had taken medicine recommended by doctors and sold by pharmacies, and who had discovered too late that the medicine was something their bodies could not stop needing. The response this produced was not primarily medical. It was political, and the politics involved were considerably uglier than the pharmaceutical industry's recklessness deserved to be paired with. The legislation that followed, the moral panic that shaped it, and the racial architecture built into its enforcement, revealed something that the history of drugs had been pointing towards since the pharaoh first controlled the grain supply. The question of which substances get treated as medicine and which get treated as crime was never really about pharmacology. It was about who was using them. The 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution took effect on January 17, 1920 at midnight. By 12:01 a.m., 6 masked men had robbed a Chicago railroad switching yard, making off with $100,000 worth of whiskey that had been legally warehoused before the ban. The police were called. The thieves were never found. It was the first 60 seconds of Prohibition, and it had already produced its first organized crime operation. The next 13 years would follow the same logic, at exponentially larger scale, with consequences so far-reaching that American society is still living inside them. Prohibition was not a sudden decision. It was the product of decades of organized political campaigning by a coalition whose internal contradictions were remarkable even by the standards of American politics. The the Women's Christian Temperance Union provided the moral framework, drawing on genuine suffering, domestic violence, poverty, family destruction, that alcohol genuinely caused in working-class communities. Protestant churches provided institutional support and political networks. But behind these legitimate grievances sat a collection of interests whose motivations were considerably less elevated. Henry Ford hated alcohol with the fervour of a man who had built an industrial empire on the premise that human beings could be optimised like machines. Sober workers arrived on time, operated machinery without killing themselves or each other, and produced more cars per hour than drunk workers. Ford funded temperance organisations extensively, not from religious conviction but from a productivity calculation. His factories required human beings to function as components in an assembly system, and components that consumed alcohol performed below specification. Prohibition was, from Ford's perspective, a workforce management policy disguised as a moral crusade. The industrialists who supported Prohibition alongside Ford were not, as a class, notable for their concern with the spiritual welfare of the working poor. They were concerned with output metrics. The timing was not coincidental. Prohibition arrived in the same era that Frederick Winslow Taylor was developing scientific management theory, reducing industrial labour to measurable, optimizable processes. A sober workforce was a more efficient workforce. The moral language of temperance provided a politically viable wrapper for what was essentially a factory productivity initiative at national scale. Racism was embedded in Prohibition's architecture from the beginning, though it was rarely stated explicitly in legislative debate. Anti-immigrant sentiment targeted the German brewing industry, the Italian wine culture, the Irish saloon, each associated with specific ethnic communities that the Anglo-Protestant establishment viewed as culturally threatening. In the South, the prohibition of alcohol was explicitly linked to controlling black communities, with temperance advocates arguing openly that alcohol made black men dangerous and that banning it was a public safety measure. The targets of Prohibition's enforcement, once it was enacted, were predictably concentrated in immigrant neighbourhoods and black communities, while elite private clubs quietly maintained their wine cellars behind closed doors with minimal interference. What Prohibition actually produced, as opposed to what it promised, was a case study in unintended consequences so comprehensive that it functions almost as a controlled experiment. Organised crime, as a sophisticated national enterprise, was essentially Prohibition's invention. Before 1920, criminal organisations in American cities were largely local, fragmented, and limited in their economic reach by the legitimate economy's dominance. Prohibition handed them an industry, alcohol distribution, that was immune to legal competition, that operated at massive scale, that required exactly the organisational skills criminals had already developed for smaller operations, and that generated profit margins so extraordinary that the money could fund political corruption at previously impossible levels. Al Capone's organisation grossed an estimated $60 million annually in the late 1920s, approximately $1 billion in contemporary terms. He paid policemen, judges, aldermen, and state legislators as routine operating expenses. The Capone organisation was not an aberration. It was the model. Every major American city developed equivalent structures: the Purple Gang in Detroit, the Jewish mob in Cleveland, the Genovese and Luciano organisations in New York. These were not loose collections of thugs. They were vertically integrated businesses with supply chains, distribution networks, quality control problems, and human resources departments operating under euphemistic names. Prohibition created the infrastructure for 20th century organised crime, and when Prohibition ended in 1933, that infrastructure didn't disappear. It diversified. The quality control problem deserves particular attention because it killed people directly and specifically. Legal alcohol, before Prohibition, was produced under conditions where manufacturers had economic incentives to maintain standards. Bad product generated complaints, lost customers, and reputational damage. Bootleg alcohol had no such feedback mechanism. Prohibition-era spirits were frequently contaminated with industrial alcohol, which the government had deliberately ordered manufacturers to denature, to add toxic substances including methanol and other poisons, specifically to prevent bootleggers from redistilling it for consumption. Bootleggers redistilled it anyway, incompletely, leaving lethal residues. The US government's deliberate poisoning of industrial alcohol killed an estimated 10,000 Americans during Prohibition. The policy designed to protect citizens from alcohol's dangers was directly causing alcohol-related deaths at a scale that the pre-Prohibition saloon system had never approached. Consumption statistics from the Prohibition era are inherently unreliable. Illegal behavior is, by definition, underreported. But the available evidence consistently suggests that alcohol consumption initially declined sharply in 1920, then gradually recovered as bootlegging networks matured, and by the late 1920s had returned to somewhere between 60% and 70% of pre-Prohibition levels. The demand had not been eliminated. It had been redirected into channels that were more dangerous, more expensive, more criminally connected, and entirely outside any form of regulatory oversight. Speakeasies, illegal drinking establishments, proliferated in every American city. New York alone was estimated to have 30,000 of them by the mid-1920s, roughly twice the number of legal saloons that had operated before the ban. The speakeasy was not simply a saloon renamed. It was a different social institution, one that, stripped of legal operating licenses and police regulation, became genuinely more dangerous in some respects while simultaneously becoming more socially integrated in others. Women, who'd been largely excluded from saloon culture, were welcomed in speakeasies, partly because their presence reduced the likelihood of police raids. Prohibition inadvertently accelerated the integration of women into American nightlife. This was not an outcome anyone had planned. The repeal came in 1933, driven by the Depression's economic logic as much as by any moral reckoning. The government desperately needed tax revenue. The alcohol industry desperately needed legitimacy. The public had spent 13 years watching Prohibition's promises dissolve into gang violence, political corruption, and poisoned spirits. The 21st Amendment passed with the support of many of the same institutional forces that had backed the 18th. The political coalition switched sides with a speed that suggested conviction had never been the primary ingredient in either direction. What should have followed repeal was a serious national examination of what Prohibition had revealed about the relationship between law and human behaviour, about the economics of demand suppression, about the consequences of creating criminal markets for substances people were determined to consume regardless of legality. That examination did not occur. Instead, the mechanisms developed during Prohibition, the legal frameworks, the enforcement philosophies, the moral vocabulary of vice and criminality, were immediately redeployed against other substances. Cannabis had been largely unregulated at the federal level before Prohibition. By 1937, it was federally banned under the Marijuana Tax Act, driven through Congress by Harry Anslinger, the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, with a campaign of racist propaganda so brazen that it reads today as almost self-parodying. Anslinger's public statements directly linked cannabis use to black jazz musicians, Mexican immigrants, and the sexual corruption of white women, a rhetorical strategy that bore no relationship to pharmacology, and every relationship to the racial anxieties of 1930s America. The scientific testimony presented during the congressional hearings was minimal and largely fabricated. The American Medical Association opposed the bill. Congress passed it anyway. The logic that had failed so comprehensively with alcohol was now being applied to cannabis, and would soon be applied to heroin, cocaine, and every other substance that fell outside the narrowing definition of acceptable intoxication. Each new prohibition created the same structure: criminal markets, organized supply chains, enforcement concentrated in poor and minority communities, and consumption rates that declined briefly before recovering as the black market matured. But the most consequential element of the Prohibition legacy wasn't the specific laws it produced. It was the political vocabulary it normalized. The idea that the proper response to a substance deemed dangerous was criminalization rather than regulation, punishment rather than treatment, enforcement rather than public health. That vocabulary would shape American drug policy for the rest of the 20th century, influencing global policy through America's international dominance, and producing suffering on a scale that dwarfed anything the substances themselves, managed differently, would have caused. The criminal organizations that Prohibition created didn't wait for the next prohibition to find their next product. They were already diversifying into heroin, already building the supply chains that would feed mid-century addiction, already positioning themselves to benefit from every subsequent wave of criminalization. The government had handed them a business model. And in the decades that followed, Washington would keep improving it, with the enthusiastic assistance of a CIA that had discovered, in the chaos of Cold War covert operations, that drug money was the cleanest dirty money available. Meanwhile, in government laboratories that operated under classifications so secret that their existence wasn't officially acknowledged for decades, scientists were doing something that made Al Capone's bootlegging operation look quaint by comparison. They were trying to weaponize the human mind, and the substance they chose for the experiment was something that would escape their control entirely, find its way to millions of people who had no idea what was coming, and change the cultural landscape of the 20th century in ways nobody had authorized and nobody could reverse. On April 19th, 1943, a Swiss chemist named Albert Hofmann rode his bicycle home from his laboratory in Basel and became the first human being to experience a full LSD trip. He had accidentally absorbed a small quantity of lysergic acid diethylamide through his fingertips while working, a compound he had first synthesized 5 years earlier and then set aside, finding no obvious pharmaceutical application. The bicycle ride home, which he later described in detail, produced visual disturbances, spatial distortion, and a profound alteration of consciousness that lasted several hours. Hofmann, being a scientist, documented everything carefully, and then, 3 days later, deliberately consumed what he calculated to be a threshold dose to confirm his hypothesis. The dose was 250 micrograms, actually far above the threshold. He spent the next several hours convinced he was dying and that his neighbour had transformed into a malevolent witch. He hadn't died. He had discovered something that the 20th century was completely unprepared for. LSD's pharmacological profile was unlike anything in the existing drug landscape. It was psychoactive at doses measured in micrograms, millionths of a gram, making it the most potent psychoactive substance known to science. It produced profound alterations in perception, thought, and sense of self, without the sedative or physically addictive properties of opiates, without the cardiovascular dangers of stimulants, and without a clear mechanism of action that fit any existing neurological framework. It was, in the clinical sense, genuinely strange, and the psychiatric community, which received early samples from Sandoz Pharmaceuticals in the late 1940s, responded with the excitement of people encountering something they had no category for. Psychiatrists used LSD to induce temporary states that resembled psychosis, hoping to understand schizophrenia from the inside. Therapists used it to accelerate the progress of psychoanalysis, finding that patients under its influence accessed emotional material that years of conventional therapy had failed to reach. Aldous Huxley took it in 1955 and wrote about the experience with a philosophical intensity that suggested he had encountered something genuinely significant about the nature of consciousness. Bill Wilson, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, underwent LSD therapy and believed it produced insights relevant to treating alcoholism. By the late 1950s, hundreds of peer-reviewed papers had been published on LSD's therapeutic potential, and the clinical consensus was cautiously optimistic. The CIA was reading these papers with different questions in mind. Operation MKUltra began in 1953, authorized by CIA Director Allen Dulles, as a response to reports that Soviet and Chinese interrogators were achieving dramatic results with captured American prisoners using unspecified brainwashing techniques. The CIA's counter-strategy was to develop its own mind control capability, and LSD, with its extraordinary potency and its dramatic effects on consciousness, seemed like exactly the tool required. What followed was one of the most extensive and ethically catastrophic research programs in American government history. The CIA administered LSD to mental patients, prisoners, drug addicts, and sex workers, populations chosen specifically because they were unlikely to be believed if they reported what had been done to them. They administered it to their own employees without warning or consent, to study how trained operatives performed under its influence. They set up safe houses in San Francisco and New York where prostitutes, under CIA direction, lured men for drinks laced with LSD, while agents observed through one-way mirrors. They paid for research at universities and hospitals under academic cover, maintaining enough institutional distance to deny direct involvement. The results were, from the CIA's operational perspective, a failure. LSD did not produce controllable subjects. It did not reliably extract information. It did not create programmable assassins. What it produced was unpredictable, sometimes terrifying, occasionally illuminating, and almost completely resistant to the kind of directed control the agency was looking for. One CIA operative who was secretly dosed during a meeting suffered a psychological crisis that required hospitalization. Another, Frank Olson, a biological weapons researcher who was dosed without his knowledge, fell from a New York hotel window 10 days later under circumstances that remain disputed. The official finding was suicide. His family has consistently argued otherwise. MKUltra was formally ended in 1973, and CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of all related documents. A congressional investigation in 1977 recovered a small fraction of the records that had survived by being misfiled in a financial archive. What those records revealed was enough to produce Senate hearings, public outrage, and a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing. What they didn't reveal, because it had been deliberately destroyed, was the full scope of experiments conducted on an estimated 150 separate research programs across 80 institutions in the United States and Canada. While the CIA was failing to weaponize LSD, the drug was escaping into civilian life through channels the agency had inadvertently created. Ken Kesey, who would later write One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, first took LSD as a paid volunteer in a government-funded study at a Veterans Administration hospital in 1960. Timothy Leary, a Harvard psychology professor, began his psychedelic research with psilocybin mushrooms in 1960 and LSD shortly after, producing research papers that his colleagues found simultaneously fascinating and methodologically alarming. The academic establishment's concern was not entirely unfounded. Leary's research increasingly blurred the boundary between scientific investigation and personal advocacy, and his eventual transformation into a counterculture icon was not a trajectory that the Harvard Psychology Department had anticipated when it hired him. By the mid-1960s, LSD had moved from research laboratories into the broader culture with a speed that the pharmaceutical distribution networks of the 19th century would have recognized. The Grateful Dead played concerts for crowds whose significant proportion was experiencing profound alterations in consciousness. The Beatles referenced psychedelic experience in their music with decreasing subtlety. Andy Warhol's factory was swimming in it. The Summer of Love in San Francisco in 1967 brought 100,000 young people to Haight-Ashbury, creating a cultural moment that the mainstream media covered as spectacle and the Nixon administration registered as threat. Nixon's response reveals exactly how thoroughly the Prohibition logic had entrenched itself in American political thinking. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 classified LSD and cannabis as Schedule I substances, the highest restriction category, reserved for drugs with no accepted medical use and high abuse potential. The scheduling decisions were made without meaningful scientific review. LSD, despite its extensive clinical research record, was placed in the same category as heroin, making any further research effectively impossible without bureaucratic obstacles so severe that most researchers abandoned the field entirely. 20 years of promising psychiatric research was shut down by a scheduling decision that had nothing to do with pharmacology. John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy chief, gave an interview in 2016, 4 decades after the fact, that removed any remaining ambiguity about the war on drugs' actual motivations. He stated directly that the Nixon administration had 2 enemies, the anti-war left and black people. He explained that by associating the anti-war left with marijuana and black people with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, the administration could disrupt those communities, arrest their leaders, and demonize them publicly. The war on drugs, as designed by the Nixon White House, was not a public health initiative. It was a political targeting operation with a public health costume. Nixon declared drugs public enemy number 1 in 1971. The machinery that followed, mandatory minimum sentences, asset forfeiture, the militarization of police drug enforcement, was built on this foundation. Reagan dramatically escalated the war on drugs in the 1980s, adding the crack cocaine panic to the political arsenal. The disparity in sentencing between crack cocaine, cheaper, more prevalent in black communities, and powder cocaine, more expensive, more prevalent in white communities, was set at 100-1 by the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. A person caught with 5 grams of crack received the same mandatory minimum sentence as someone caught with 500 grams of powder cocaine. Same molecule, radically different legal treatment. The variable wasn't chemistry, it was race and class. MDMA traced a different trajectory through the same system, and its story is almost a perfect parallel construction to LSD's, with one additional layer of absurdity. MDMA was first synthesized by Merck in 1912, not as a recreational drug but as a chemical intermediate in the synthesis of a blood-clotting agent. It was patented and forgotten. Decades later, in 1976, a California chemist named Alexander Shulgin resynthesized it, tested it on himself, and recognized its unusual properties, a combination of stimulant and empathogenic effects that produce profound feelings of emotional openness and interpersonal connection without the perceptual distortions of psychedelics. Shulgin introduced it to a network of therapists who began using it in couples counseling and trauma therapy in the late 1970s and early 1980s, operating quietly and without fanfare in private practices. The clinical results were remarkable. patients with post-traumatic stress disorder who had not responded to conventional therapy made significant progress after MDMA-assisted sessions. Couples with entrenched communication failures reported breakthroughs. Therapists described it as the most powerful therapeutic tool they had ever encountered. This underground clinical community operated without government approval, but also without government interference, for several years, because the drug was not yet scheduled and nobody in Washington was paying attention to quiet therapy offices in California. Then it reached the nightclubs of Dallas. By 1985, MDMA, now called ecstasy, was being sold commercially in bars, advertised on chalkboards alongside drink specials, consumed recreationally by people who had no idea it had a therapeutic history. The DEA moved immediately to Schedule I classification. The therapist who had been using it clinically submitted evidence and requested a hearing. An administrative law judge reviewed the evidence and recommended Schedule III, acknowledging the drug's legitimate medical applications. The DEA overruled the recommendation and placed MDMA in Schedule I anyway. The therapeutic research stopped. The recreational use continued. The scheduling had protected nobody and prevented nothing, except the clinical work that might have helped people who genuinely needed it. The United States spent over $1 trillion on the war on drugs between 1971 and 2021. Drug use rates at the end of that period were essentially identical to drug use rates at the beginning. The prison population, however, had grown by 500%, with drug offences accounting for the majority of the increase. The war on drugs had not reduced drug use. It had successfully transferred enormous wealth from public budgets to prison construction contracts, and it had incarcerated a generation of mostly young, mostly poor, mostly black and Latino men for conduct that, in a different zip code or a different income bracket, would never have produced an arrest. The war had failed by every public health metric it claimed to care about. It had succeeded spectacularly by every political metric it actually served. And while it raged, the pharmaceutical industry, operating entirely within the legal economy, with government approval and medical legitimacy, was quietly building an addiction crisis that would kill more Americans than any illegal drug had ever managed. In 1996, Purdue Pharma launched OxyContin with a marketing campaign so aggressive, so precisely engineered, and so deliberately dishonest that it would eventually be described by federal prosecutors as one of the most consequential frauds in American corporate history. The drug itself, oxycodone in a time-release formulation, was not new. Oxycodone had existed since 1916. What Purdue sold wasn't primarily a molecule, it was a claim that OxyContin's time-release mechanism made it less addictive than immediate-release opioids because the drug entered the bloodstream gradually rather than in a sudden rush. The claim was stated confidently, repeated constantly, and embedded in every layer of the company's sales strategy. It was also false, and the people making it knew it was false. Internal Purdue documents, later obtained through litigation, showed that company researchers had identified OxyContin's addiction potential years before launch. Sales representatives were trained to minimize addiction risk in conversations with physicians. The company's bonus structure rewarded representatives specifically for increasing prescription volume in high-dosage categories, the prescriptions most likely to produce dependence. Purdue tracked pill mill doctors, physicians prescribing OxyContin in volumes so extreme they could only be explained by negligence or corruption, and continued supplying them long after the pattern was internally documented. The sales force deployed against American physicians was unprecedented in pharmaceutical history. Purdue employed approximately 1,000 sales representatives in OxyContin's launch year, rising to over 2,000 within a decade. Each representative carried a territory, a quota, and a toolkit that included free samples, branded merchandise, and an OxyContin Partners program that invited physicians to all expenses-paid resort conferences where the agenda balanced continuing medical education with golf, meals, and entertainment. The conferences were legal. The intent was transparent. Physicians who attended prescribed more OxyContin afterward. The correlation was documented by Purdue's own internal analysis. The FDA's approval process, which should have caught the false addiction claim before the drug reached market, failed at multiple levels. A single FDA medical reviewer, Curtis Wright, was primarily responsible for evaluating OxyContin's application. He approved the label language claiming reduced addiction potential based on data that did not support the claim. 18 months after approving OxyContin, Wright left the FDA and took a job at Purdue Pharma. His starting salary was approximately 10 times his government pay. The revolving door between regulatory agencies and the industries they regulated was not a secret. It was standard operating procedure, institutionalized across decades of pharmaceutical, financial, and energy regulation. But its consequences in this particular case were measured in human lives at a scale that concentrated the mind. Prescription opioid use exploded through the late 1990s and 2000s, with the kind of growth curve that, in any other commercial context, would be celebrated as a business success story. Between 1999 and 2010, the quantity of prescription opioids sold in the United States quadrupled. Family physicians in rural Appalachia were prescribing quantities that would have seemed extraordinary to any experienced addiction specialist. 30-day supplies of high-dose oxycodone for back pain, refilled month after month, year after year, generating dependency in patients who had entered the system with entirely legitimate pain complaints. The geography of the epidemic's first wave was not random. It concentrated in specific regions with specific economic and social characteristics: rural Appalachia, rural New England, the post-industrial Midwest. These were communities where manufacturing employment had collapsed, where economic prospects had contracted for a generation, where chronic pain from physical labor and workplace injuries was genuinely prevalent, and where physicians, often isolated from specialist networks, relied heavily on pharmaceutical company guidance about prescribing practices. The drug didn't create vulnerability in these communities. It found vulnerability that was already there and monetized it with extraordinary efficiency. By 2010, the United States, with 5% of the world's population, was consuming 80% of the world's oxycodone supply. The number deserves a moment of genuine stillness. 80%. The entire rest of the planet, Europe, Asia, Africa, South America, every nation and every population combined, consumed the remaining 20%. This was not a drug epidemic in the conventional sense. It was a specifically American phenomenon, produced by a specifically American combination of pharmaceutical industry power, regulatory capture, physician incentive structures, and a healthcare system that treated pain management as a billing category rather than a medical discipline. Then the government acted, and its intervention, well-intentioned and partially effective at its stated goal, triggered the epidemic's second and far deadlier wave. Beginning around 2010, the DEA and state medical boards dramatically tightened prescription opioid regulations. Prescription monitoring programs forced physicians to track patient prescriptions across providers, eliminating the doctor shopping that had allowed heavy users to accumulate pills from multiple sources. Abuse-deterrent formulations made OxyContin harder to crush and snort. The pill mills that had operated openly in Florida and other states were shut down in coordinated enforcement actions. Prescription opioid availability contracted sharply. The people who had developed physical dependence on prescription opioids didn't stop being dependent because the prescription stopped. Their bodies still required opioids to function without withdrawal. the sweating, vomiting, cramping, and psychological agony that opioid cessation produces in dependent users, they needed a substitute. Heroin, which had been declining in American cities for decades, was now cheap, widely available, and pharmacologically identical in its mechanism of action to the pills people could no longer access. The transition from prescription pills to street heroin happened at population scale within a period of roughly 2 years. Studies showed that approximately 80% of heroin users in the early 2000s had begun with prescription opioids. The prescription crackdown had not ended the epidemic. It had redirected it into a supply chain controlled by criminal organizations rather than pharmaceutical companies. The third wave arrived when those criminal organizations discovered fentanyl. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid developed in 1960 for surgical anesthesia. It is approximately 100 times more potent than morphine by weight, meaning a fatal dose is measured in micrograms, invisible to the naked eye, transferable on a fingertip. Its extraordinary potency made it economically irresistible to drug traffickers. A kilogram of fentanyl, costing a few $1,000s to produce in a clandestine laboratory, could be used to produce hundreds of thousands of individual doses. The profit margins were so extreme they made the cocaine trade look modest by comparison. By 2016, fentanyl had spread into the heroin supply so thoroughly that buying heroin without fentanyl contamination was becoming the exception rather than the rule. By 2020, fentanyl was present in essentially every category of illicit drug supply in North America: heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, counterfeit prescription pills. People who had never intentionally consumed an opioid were dying of fentanyl overdoses after taking what they believed was cocaine or a fake Xanax pill. The drug had escaped the opioid category entirely and become a contaminant in the general drug supply. In 2017, opioids killed more Americans than car accidents, a statistic that required a moment to process because car accidents had been the dominant cause of accidental death in America for so long that their position seemed immovable. In 2020, drug overdose deaths exceeded 90,000 for the first time. In 2021, they exceeded 100,000. Every year from 2013 onward set a new record. The cumulative death toll from opioid overdoses between 1999 and 2021 exceeded 500,000 Americans, more than the total American combat deaths in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan combined. The Sackler family, whose ownership of Purdue Pharma had made them one of the wealthiest philanthropic dynasties in the world. Their name graced wings of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Louvre, Oxford University, the Guggenheim, initially defended their conduct with the confidence of people who had never seriously contemplated accountability. The museums that had accepted their money faced escalating public pressure to return it or remove their name from buildings. Some did. Others engaged in the specific institutional calculation that involves weighing moral clarity against marble staircases. Purdue Pharma eventually pleaded guilty to federal criminal charges in 2020, acknowledging that it had illegally marketed OxyContin and paid illegal kickbacks to physicians. The company filed for bankruptcy. The Sackler family, through a settlement that was contested in courts for years, paid approximately $4.5 billion while members personally avoided criminal prosecution. The settlement amount represented a fraction of the estimated $35 billion the family had extracted from the company during the epidemic years. The financial architecture of accountability, which required the company to pay while the individuals who directed the company's conduct retained most of their personal wealth, produced a result that was technically legal and morally incoherent in roughly equal measure. The epidemic's racial dimension exposed the same double standard that had run through American drug policy since the opium dens of the 19th century. The crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s, which devastated black urban communities, had been met with mandatory minimum sentences, mass incarceration, and rhetorical framing that centered criminality and moral failure. The opioid epidemic, which initially devastated predominantly white rural and suburban communities, was met with congressional hearings, expanded treatment funding, and rhetorical framing that centered victimhood and the pharmaceutical industry's predatory conduct. Both framings contained truth. The crack epidemic's victims were also victims of predatory supply chains and structural economic devastation, facts that the 1980s policy conversation almost entirely ignored. The opioid epidemic's victims were also making choices within systems that offered them limited alternatives, facts that the compassionate framing sometimes obscured. The difference in response revealed not a philosophical evolution in how America understood addiction, but a demographic variable in who the addicted population happened to be. The question that Lin Zexu had asked Queen Victoria in 1839, how could a government justify poisoning another population for profit, had finally been asked inside the borders of the country that had helped design the international framework for drug control. The answer, it turned out, was the same in 1996 as it had been in 1839. Carefully, legally, with excellent paperwork, and with just enough distance between the decision-makers and the consequences to make accountability genuinely difficult to assign. The opioid crisis was not an accident. It was not an unforeseen consequence. It was the predictable output of a system designed to maximize pharmaceutical revenue without meaningful constraint, operating in a regulatory environment shaped by the industry it was supposed to oversee. 5,000 years of drug history had produced, in the most medically sophisticated nation on earth, a catastrophe administered by physicians, approved by regulators, funded by investors, and defended by lawyers, right up until the moment the body count became too large to explain away. In 2004, a Harvard sophomore named Mark Zuckerberg launched a social networking platform from his dorm room. In 2007, Apple released a device that put the internet in every pocket. In 2009, a former Google employee named Asa Raskin introduced a feature called infinite scroll, the mechanism by which social media feeds never end, never pause, and never require a deliberate action to continue. Raskin later stated publicly that infinite scroll had cost humanity approximately 200,000 collective hours of attention per day, and that he had invented it in approximately one weekend. He also said he regretted it. His regret, sincere as it may have been, was roughly as useful as Bayer's retrospective feelings about heroin. The human brain produces dopamine, a neurotransmitter associated with anticipation, reward, and the motivation to repeat behaviors, in response to unpredictable positive stimuli. This is not a controversial finding. It is one of the most replicated results in neuroscience, established through decades of research by scientists who are studying addiction, reward pathways, and behavioral reinforcement in contexts that had nothing to do with technology. A variable reward schedule, one where the reward comes unpredictably, sometimes never, occasionally spectacularly, produces stronger dopamine responses and more compulsive repetition than predictable rewards. Slot machines operate on this principle. So does pulling down on a social media feed to see if anything new has appeared. The engineers who built the attention economy were not ignorant of this research. They commissioned it, refined it, and applied it with a precision that the pharmaceutical industry of the 19th century, working without neuroscience, could never have achieved. Sean Parker, Facebook's founding president, gave a public interview in 2017 in which he described the platform's design philosophy with a candor that was either brave or reckless, depending on how one evaluated the timing. He stated that the founding question was explicitly how to consume as much of users' time and conscious attention as possible. The solution was the like button, a mechanism that gave users a small hit of social validation on a variable schedule, exploiting exactly the dopamine vulnerability that addiction researchers had been documenting for decades. Parker described the people who built these systems as having understood the human psychological weakness they were exploiting, and having done it anyway. He used the phrase, "a little dopamine hit." He was not speaking metaphorically. Chamath Palihapitiya, a former Facebook vice president, made similar statements the same year, saying he felt tremendous guilt about the tools he'd helped build and that they were ripping apart the social fabric in ways that nobody fully understood. These admissions were remarkable, not because they were surprising. The behavioral design of social media platforms had been analysed by researchers for years, but because they came from inside the industry, from people who'd been compensated extraordinarily well to build the thing they were now describing as harmful. The neurological comparison between social media engagement and chemical addiction is not metaphor, it is mechanism. Brain imaging studies comparing heavy social media users with substance-dependent individuals show overlapping patterns of activity in the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for impulse control, decision-making, and the capacity to delay gratification. Both groups show reduced grey matter density in regions associated with self-regulation. Both groups demonstrate heightened reactivity to their specific reward stimulus and reduced capacity to disengage voluntarily. Both groups experience withdrawal-like symptoms, anxiety, irritability, difficulty concentrating, when deprived of access to their substance or platform. The neuroscience does not treat these as analogous conditions. It treats them as expressions of the same underlying neurological process operating through different inputs. What distinguishes digital addiction from chemical addiction, structurally, is not the neurological mechanism but the delivery system. A person addicted to heroin must acquire heroin through a supply chain that involves illegality, expense, and physical effort. A person whose dopamine system has been captured by social media notification cycles carries the delivery mechanism in their pocket, has paid for unlimited access to it, and lives in a social environment where continuous engagement is not only permitted but expected and professionally rewarded. The friction that limits chemical addiction, cost, availability, social stigma, physical inconvenience, is entirely absent. The drug is free, legal, universally available, and culturally normalized. Its dealers are the most valuable companies in human history. Cannabis legalization, spreading across American states from 2012 onward and reaching national level in Canada in 2018, produced the first serious policy experiment in regulated recreational drug markets since Prohibition's repeal. The results have been mixed, instructive, and largely ignored by the political conversations that most needed to engage with them. Legal cannabis markets did not produce the social catastrophe that Prohibition advocates predicted. Youth consumption rates in states with legal markets did not increase significantly compared to states where cannabis remained illegal, a finding directly contrary to the primary argument for continued prohibition, which centered on protecting young people from access. Tax revenues were substantial. Criminal market activity in cannabis declined. The racial disparity in cannabis arrests. Black Americans had been arrested for cannabis at nearly 4 times the rate of white Americans despite roughly equal usage rates, narrowed significantly in legal markets, though it did not disappear entirely, because decades of policy don't reverse overnight simply because the law changes. What legal markets did produce was a commercialization dynamic that echoed every previous chapter of this story. Cannabis companies, operating with investment capital and marketing budgets, immediately began developing products specifically engineered for maximum potency and compulsive use. The average THC content of cannabis products sold in legal markets increased dramatically, from an average of roughly 4% in the 1990s to products routinely exceeding 90% concentration in modern concentrate forms. The regulatory frameworks that were supposed to manage this escalation were, in most states, written by legislatures with minimal expertise in pharmacology and significant influence from the industry being regulated. The pattern repeated with the reliability of a physical law: commercialization, escalation, regulatory capture, consequences arriving after the lobby had finished writing the rules. The psychedelic renaissance arrived simultaneously and represented something genuinely different from the commercialization story, though whether it would stay different was an open question. Psilocybin, the active compound in magic mushrooms, had been researched clinically in the 1950s and 1960s before the Controlled Substances Act made further work essentially impossible. When researchers at Johns Hopkins and NYU finally obtained approval for new clinical trials in the early 2000s, the results they produced with terminal cancer patients, with treatment-resistant depression, and with addiction disorders were striking enough to shift the scientific conversation significantly. Patients who had been depressed for decades reported sustained remission after 1 or 2 psilocybin sessions. Terminal cancer patients reported dramatic reductions in death anxiety. Alcoholics and smokers reported cessation rates that far exceeded any existing pharmacological intervention. MDMA, simultaneously moving through Phase 3 clinical trials for PTSD treatment under FDA oversight, was producing results in combat veterans and sexual assault survivors that conventional psychiatric medication had failed to approach. The same drug that the DEA had placed in Schedule 1 in 1985, overruling its own administrative law judge, was now being designated a breakthrough therapy by the FDA, a classification reserved for drugs that show substantial improvement over existing treatments for serious conditions. The institutional apparatus of drug control was, with visible awkwardness, reversing positions it had held for 40 years without formally acknowledging that the original positions had been wrong. The reversal pointed towards something that ran beneath the entire 5,000-year arc of this story, a question about why humans seek altered states at all, that neither prohibitionist nor libertarian frameworks had ever answered adequately. The Sumerian priest who consumed opium to communicate with the divine, the Andean messenger who chewed coca to run across mountains, the Greek philosopher who drank kykeon at Eleusis, the Victorian morphine addict prescribed dependency by a confident physician, the American teenager scrolling at 3 a.m. waiting for a notification that might or might not arrive. All of them were doing the same thing at the neurological level. They were attempting to move their consciousness from where it was to somewhere that felt more bearable, more meaningful, more connected, or simply less painful than ordinary reality. The substances and mechanisms changed across 5 millennia. The underlying human need did not change at all, and every civilization that tried to address that need primarily through prohibition discovered the same thing. You cannot legislate away a neurological drive. You can redirect it, exploit it, suppress its expression temporarily, or design entire economic systems around capturing it. But you cannot make human beings stop wanting to feel different than they currently feel. The Pharaoh knew this. So did the British East India Company. So did the engineers in Menlo Park who designed the Infinite Scroll. The most honest statement in 5,000 years of drug history might be this: every society gets the addictions it designs for. Ancient Egypt designed a society around state-controlled beer and got compliant pyramid builders. Victorian Britain designed a society around pharmaceutical optimism and got 250,000 morphine addicts. 20th century America designed a society around criminalization and got both mass incarceration and record overdose deaths simultaneously. 21st century Silicon Valley designed a society around captured attention and got a generation of young people whose rates of anxiety, depression, and loneliness have climbed in direct proportion to the time they spend on platforms specifically engineered to keep them there. The psychedelic researchers who are currently producing the most promising results in addiction treatment share a finding across different substances, different patient populations, and different disorders. What seems to drive the therapeutic effect is not primarily the pharmacology of the drug. It is the experience of connection to other people, to something larger than the individual self, to a sense of meaning that ordinary consciousness, worn down by chronic pain or trauma or simple grinding modern existence, cannot easily access. The first high 5,000 years ago was about exactly this. The shaman consumed the mushroom to connect the community to forces it couldn't reach alone. The Vedic priest drank soma to dissolve the boundary between the human and the sacred. What humanity has been reaching for through every substance and every screen is not oblivion. It is contact. The tragedy of 5,000 years of drug history is not that humans kept seeking that contact through chemical means. The tragedy is that the systems built around those chemicals, the empires, the corporations, the criminal organizations, the regulatory agencies, consistently found it more profitable to exploit the seeking than to address what was being sought. The seeking continues. It always has, and the next substance, the next platform, the next molecule designed in a laboratory to hit the dopamine system with surgical precision is already being developed, right now, today, by someone who understands the neuroscience perfectly and has not yet decided whether that knowledge is a responsibility or an opportunity. History suggests they will choose the latter. History also suggests that the cost of that choice will be paid by people who had no say in the decision. It always is.